21.9 billion euros. That's what the European Union paid Russia for oil, gas, and coal in 2024, according to Ember Energy's tracking of EU customs data. 18.7 billion euros. That's what the EU sent to Ukraine in financial aid that same year. Europe handed Moscow more money for fossil fuels than it handed Kyiv to survive the war Moscow started. This wasn't a one-year accident. Russian gas imports to the EU rose 18% in 2024, from 38 billion cubic meters to 45 billion, according to Ember Energy. The increases landed mostly in Italy, Czechia, and France. By 2025, EU countries had imported just over 15 million tons of Russian liquefied natural gas, according to Kepler data reported by Natural Gas Intelligence, 28% above the pre-war average. Urgewald, the German energy watchdog, puts the EU's 2025 spending on Russian LNG alone at 7.2 billion euros. Pipeline gas tells a different story. Russia's share of EU pipeline imports collapsed from around 40% in 2021 to roughly 6% in 2025, according to the Council of the EU. But combine pipeline and LNG together, and Russia still supplied something like 12 to 13% of all the gas the EU imported last year, 3.5 years into a war, justified partly by the need to stop funding the aggressor. Russian gas is still crossing into Belgium, into France, into Hungary. The number that should have gone to zero didn't. This isn't the first time a Western government tried to force Europe to cut a Russian gas dependency, and it isn't the first time that effort ran into European resistance. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan tried to stop a pipeline from being built at all. Not phase it out, but stop it before the first meter of pipe went into the ground. The pipeline in question was the Urengoy-Pommery-Uzhhorod line, a Soviet project Western reporters nicknamed the Siberian Pipeline. It's the same physical corridor, more or less, that carried Russian gas into Europe through Ukraine for the next 4 decades, the transit route that only shut down for good on January 1st, 2025, when Kyiv declined to renew the contract. Reagan lost that fight. By the late 1970s, Western Europe was still reeling from 2 oil shocks and looking for any way to reduce its reliance on Middle Eastern crude. The Soviet Union held one of the largest gas reserves on the planet and needed hard currency and Western industrial technology to reach it. In 1978, Moscow proposed a new pipeline out of the Urengoy field in western Siberia. The deal that took shape over the next 3 years became known in the West as gas for pipes. Soviet gas, shipped west for 25 years, paid for partly in large-diameter steel pipe, and compressor turbines, built in West Germany, France, Italy, and Britain. West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt opened formal talks with Moscow in 1980, working to preserve the détente-era relationship his predecessor Willy Brandt had built. On July 24, 1981, Schmidt's government signed a framework agreement with the Soviets. Within days, a consortium of German banks led by Deutsche Bank agreed to extend 3.4 billion Deutsche Marks in credit to finance the compressor stations alone. By late 1981, the Soviet side had signed 25-year supply contracts with Rurgas in West Germany and Gaz de France, locking in deliveries of up to 29 billion cubic meters of gas a year. The engineering was enormous for its time. A trunk line stretching 4,650 kilometers, 56-inch pipe, 41 compressor stations, a total project cost estimated at $22 billion, $7 billion of it in equipment bought from the West. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency's own 1982 assessment, projected the pipeline would net Moscow around $10 billion in hard currency after loan repayments, money the Reagan administration argued would help fund Soviet military spending during one of the coldest stretches of the Cold War. Reagan tried to stop it twice. The second attempt turned into a crisis. His first move came on October 16, 1981, an embargo on the export of American oil and gas equipment technology, meant to slow the project down. It didn't work, and it didn't stay contained to policy. On December 13, 1981, the Soviet-backed government in Poland declared martial law and moved against the Solidarity trade union movement. 16 days later, Reagan announced sanctions against both the USSR and Poland, ordering American companies to halt work on the Siberian pipeline entirely. That order covered equipment already under contract, pipe-laying vehicles, turbine parts, components already promised to European buyers. Then, on June 18, 1982, Reagan went further than any American president had gone before. He extended the sanctions to foreign subsidiaries of American companies and to foreign firms merely operating under American technology licenses, retroactively even covering equipment that had already shipped. That single decision turned a dispute over Soviet policy into a fight between Washington and its own allies. French subsidiary Dresser France, the French turbine manufacturer Alstom Atlantique, Britain's John Brown Engineering, and Italy's Nuovo Pignone were all caught in the net, ordered by Washington to stop supplying a project their own governments had told them to finish. Margaret Thatcher, then British Prime Minister, pushed back hard on the extraterritorial reach of the order. The French Foreign Ministry described it as something close to economic warfare against its allies in Western Europe. The European Economic Community filed a formal diplomatic protest on July 14th and a second one in August, challenging the retroactive reach of the sanctions specifically. Inside the administration, the fight was just as sharp. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger wanted the sanctions extended further, while Secretary of State Alexander Haig resigned on June 25, 1982, amid a broader set of policy clashes that included, but weren't limited to, the pipeline dispute. One National Security Council exchange, later declassified, captured how personal the enforcement had become. Weinberger noted that Alstom Atlantique's president had indicated he'd halt turbine production for the Soviets if the president of General Electric called him and asked, suggesting compliance might hinge less on the force of American law and more on a phone call between corporate executives. European governments answered by instructing their companies to keep shipping anyway, arguing that existing signed contracts had to be honored regardless of what Washington ordered. Reagan signaled he'd ease the sanctions by early September, and on November 14, 1982, he lifted them entirely. The pipeline was finished and running by 1984, essentially as planned. The corridor Reagan tried to kill in its crib carried Soviet, then Russian, gas into Europe for the next 40 years, right up until Ukraine shut off transit on January 1st, 2025. What's the same is the basic shape of the argument. A government insisting that continued economic entanglement with a geopolitical rival creates future leverage, and European governments choosing near-term economic and industrial interests over that argument. In 1982, it was Washington pressuring reluctant allies. European companies and governments in West Germany, France, Britain, and Italy prioritized signed contracts, factory jobs, and diversified energy supply over aligning with American strategy. A similar instinct is visible in Hungary and Slovakia today, the two EU states most reliant on Russian pipeline gas via Turkstream, both of which have had to submit separate diversification plans to Brussels, because they resisted the pace of the broader EU exit. Both episodes also produced the same accusation of hypocrisy. In 1982, critics noted Washington was punishing Europe for pipeline contracts, while simultaneously restoring its own grain sales to the Soviet Union. In the 2020s, the accusation is that American LNG producers are commercial beneficiaries of European diversification away from Russia. American exports to the EU nearly quadrupled, from 21 billion cubic meters in 2021 to an estimated 81 billion in 2025, now 57% of all EU LNG imports. Greenpeace Belgium put it plainly, warning policymakers not to trade Putin's gas for what they called Trump's gas. In both eras, formal political commitment did not immediately translate into falling numbers. Contracts signed in 1981 were honored despite an active American sanctions regime. Russian LNG imports into the EU kept rising for 2 straight years after the EU declared its phase-out intention in 2022. The differences matter more than the similarities. The trigger is reversed. Reagan was trying to prevent a dependency from being created in the first place. The EU today is trying to unwind a dependency that already existed and that deepened for decades after Reagan lost his fight. Nord Stream 1 opened in 2011. Nord Stream 2 was built between 2018 and 2021. Both constructed long after the Siberian pipeline crisis was history. The direction of pressure is reversed, too. In 1982, it was Washington pushing a reluctant Europe. Today, it's European institutions themselves driving the exit through the Council of the EU and the European Commission's own Repower EU roadmap, not an outside power dictating terms. The mechanism keeping gas flowing is different as well. In the 1980s, Europe kept its side of the pipeline deal because the contracts were legally binding, and Washington's order came from outside. There was a real argument that European companies were obligated to deliver. Today, continuation is driven by convenience and price, not legal obligation. The EU's own sanctions regime targeted Russian oil and coal early in the war while leaving gas largely untouched and buyers in France. Belgium and Spain kept purchasing Russian LNG on ordinary commercial terms because it was available and competitively priced. Most importantly, the outcome so far runs in the opposite direction. Reagan's sanctions failed outright. The pipeline got built regardless. The EU's slower, messier phase-out is, this time, actually working. Russian pipeline gas's share of EU imports fell from around 40% to roughly 6% between 2021 and 2025, and a legally binding ban on all Russian gas imports is now in force, with pipeline gas required to end by autumn 2027 and LNG by the end of this year. The parallel has real limits, and they're worth naming plainly rather than letting the story flatten into a tidy rhyme. This is not simply history repeating with different names. The two disputes involve different governments applying pressure in opposite directions for opposite reasons, with opposite results so far. Reagan's sanctions were a preventive strike against a deal not yet built. The EU's regulation is a cleanup of a dependency built over 4 decades, much of it after his fight was already lost. There's also a naming trap worth flagging. 1980s press coverage referred to the Urengoy project loosely as the Yamal pipeline, but that name technically belongs to a separate pipeline built in the 1990s through Belarus and Poland. Conflating the two makes for a cleaner story and a less accurate one. And the diplomatic politics around today's story, the extradition disputes over the Nord Stream sabotage suspects, the friction between Warsaw and Berlin over how to even characterize the perpetrators, has no real equivalent in the 1980s dispute, which was a fight over policy and contracts, not sabotage and criminal prosecution, where the two stories' rhyme is narrower than it first sounds. Same ecohidor, same underlying tension between security logic and commercial logic, different governments pulling in different directions, and so far, a different ending. Here is where things actually stand. The EU's phase-out regulation is legally binding, in force since February 3rd, 2026, with a stepwise ban that started applying in March. Full elimination of Russian pipeline gas is required by autumn 2027. A full LNG ban lands by the end of this year, with existing long-term contracts required to wind down by January of next year. And yet Russian gas was still the EU's third largest supplier as of the first quarter of 2026, at roughly 15% of imports, and Russian gas moving through Turkey via Turkstream kept rising even after direct Ukraine transit ended. The Nord Stream sabotage case remains active in German courts, with prosecutors alleging a team of Ukrainian divers used the yacht Andromeda to carry out the attack, a case tangled up in extradition fights between Poland and Germany that are still unresolved. History doesn't offer a clean verdict here, and it shouldn't be forced into one. What it does offer is a genuine data point. The last time a Western government tried to override European commercial interests on Russian gas by force, it lost, and the pipeline got built anyway. This time, the pressure is coming from inside Europe's own institutions, not from Washington, and the numbers so far are actually moving the other direction. Whether that holds through 2027, when the pipeline ban is supposed to take full effect, is the real test. The 1980s don't answer that question. They only tell you it's been asked before and what it costs the side that lost.